Hello, and welcome to Secret File, a new podcast that explores the intersection between political corruption, organized crime, and occasionally the worlds of intelligence and espionage. I'm your host, Peter Grant. I'm an independent writer and researcher. Recently published a book entitled While We Slept: Vladimir Putin, Donald Trump, and the Corruption of American Democracy. For today's first ever episode of the podcast, I'm going to be interviewing the one and only Dan Moldea. Dan is a specialist on organized crime and political corruption. He's been conducting investigations since 1974. He has published numerous excellent books on a wide variety of topics. However, his first book, The Hoffa Wars: Teamsters, Rebels, Politicians, and the Mob, which was published in 1978, was on the subject of Jimmy Hoffa. And Hoffa has been in Dan's investigative crosshairs for decades. He's the authority on the subject. But he's written on many others. He's also written an excellent book called Dark Victory: Ronald Reagan, MC, and the Mob. He explored the connections of organized crime into the National Football League and interference, how organized crime influences professional football. He's written about the assassination of Robert Kennedy and many, many other subjects. However, today we are going to focus narrowly on Jimmy Hoffa. However, Hoffa lived such an extraordinary life and touched upon so many different aspects of the political scene in the United States that we're going to cover a great deal while we discuss Hoffa. People may agree or disagree with some of Dan's conclusions on areas such as Hoffa's involvement with the JFK assassination, and he also has a pretty remarkable theory on the whereabouts of Hoffa's body. But one thing is indisputable is that Dan's work in this field over decades has unearthed so many facts that otherwise the public would have been unaware of. Dan has he's dedicated decades of his life to this, and so we're all in his debt. Anyways, thank you so much for tuning in to this inaugural episode. And now I will present to you my conversation with the one and only Dan Moldea. This is Secret File, and I am your host, Peter Grant. And I couldn't possibly be happier today to be speaking with a world expert on the subject of today's podcast, which is the disappearance and murder of James Riddle Hoffa, better known as Jimmy Hoffa. So I'm here speaking with Dan Moldea. Dan, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Proud to be here.
So during his lifetime, Jimmy Hoffa was one of the most prominent and powerful and controversial Americans on the scene. He was a household name. Anybody who was anybody had heard the name Jimmy Hoffa, and yet here we are just over 49 years after his disappearance, and there's probably a lot of Americans who aren't familiar with Jimmy Hoffa. So for the benefit of people like that, Dan, would you just give a basic explanation of who
Sure.
was Jimmy Hoffa and why was he important?
The Teamsters Union was a labor organization that was controlling people, representing people who were involved in the trucking industry. You know, what was on trucks was loaded by Teamsters. What people who were driving trucks were Teamsters. And one of the key organizers during the early 1930s was a guy named Jimmy Hoffa. Hoffa was a working class hero. He was a champion of the rank and file when he first started. And ironically, he was in the same town, Detroit, as a great labor leader named Walter Reuther, who was the head of the United Auto Workers Union. Hoffa found himself in a situation where the Teamsters Union in Detroit were threatening the Teamster Church, specifically Local 299, which was Hoffa's home local. And the CIO raiders were operated by a guy named Denny Lewis, who was I think he was the brother of John L. Lewis, who was the head of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO, which later merged with the the American Federation of Labor to form the AFL-CIO. And Denny Lewis and his raiders were much tougher than Hoffa's guys were, or at least they outnumbered him, or at least they were more effective. So Hoffa, debasing himself, ruining himself for all time, went to some mafia guys in Detroit. And they had the muscle to be able to run the CIO raiders out of town. The theory that you often hear from the shills and the fans of Jimmy Hoffa is that he went to the mob to use them against stubborn employers who refused to be unionized. That's not true. He went to the mob to help him run the CIO out of Detroit when they were going up against the Teamsters. So Hoffa, the specific guys he went up to, he used were a guy named Frank Coppola. There were several others, Peter Vitale, Jimmy Quasarano. I mean, and they basically owned Jimmy Hoffa after that. He dropped himself, but potentially being a great union leader, to really nothing more than a labor racketeer. And so Hoffa started, creating things like a health and welfare fund for his members in the Central States region, which evolved into the Central States, Southeast and Southwest Area Pension Fund, which was, I think, the largest union pension fund in the country. But it was a bankroll for the mafia. There was a mob guy named Alan Dorfman who's had no experience in the insurance industry, but his father, Paul Dorfman, was a Jewish gangster in Chicago. He was involved with the Chicago Waste Handlers Union. Alan Dorfman was a war hero. He was a Marine and a war hero in World War II. He started a company called Union Casualty, as I recall. And it was through Union Casualty that he created these health and welfare funds, and then later became the fiduciary manager of the Teamsters Pension Fund, the Central States, Southeast, and Southwest Areas Pension Fund. So it was generally known that when loans went out, often to Las Vegas casinos and to management operations and harebrained real estate projects out in California and elsewhere, that the Teamsters, specifically Hoffa, and other members of the General Executive Board would be getting I think it was a 10% kickback on the loans that would go out. Consequently, they attracted the attention of the federal government, specifically Hoffa. Hoffa, while he was rising in power in the Midwest, a guy named Dave Beck became president, I think in 1952. Hoffa became a vice president after he had survived the Kennedy-Hoffa hearings. And the Kennedy-Hoffa hearings were hearings by the United States Senate, chaired by Estes Kennedy-Hoffa, the senator from Tennessee, who was investigating the organized crime institutionalized in cities. And he would have, instead of having all their hearings in Washington, they would go to, I think it was 15 different cities where they would hold hearings, and they would call to testify, not just law enforcement people, but they would call citizen groups, and they would encourage the formation of crime commissions in these local. It was a very legitimate investigation. They did some very excellent work, but it lasted from 51 to 52, and then it kind of fell apart. And as I say, Jimmy Hoffa became a vice president of the Teamsters in 1952. Then fast forward into 1957, there was a lot of activity that happened in 1957. There was the Appalachian Conference right near Binghamton, New York, where the big Mafia conference, where all these mob guys wound up meeting at Joe Barbera's estate, and which was raided by the New York State Police. And then there was the murder of Albert Anastasia. There was the rise of Vito Genovese, who basically replaced Anastasia in what became known as the Genovese crime family. And then there was an investigation that started. And the investigation was started by a senator from Arkansas named John McClellan. And McClellan had on his committee people like Frank Church. He had people like John Kennedy, the junior senator from Massachusetts. And his chief counsel was Robert Kennedy. Robert Kennedy, during the Senate Rackets Committee, the McClellan Committee, the Senate Rackets Committee, Bobby Kennedy was eating mob guys for breakfast during this period of time. Bobby Kennedy really showed his talent for going after the mafia during his time at the Senate Rackets Committee, where he had tremendous investigators working with him. Walter Sheridan, who was my mentor, who ended up going with Bobby Kennedy to the Justice Department when he became Attorney General. Carmine Bolino, Pierre Salinger. I mean, a litany of wonderful, wonderful investigators who really went after the mafia in a very sincere and organized way. And then when the Senate Rackets Committee went from 1957 to 1960, John Kennedy beat Richard Nixon, the vice president at the time under Dwight Eisenhower. And it's important to note that, one of my sources, Ed Parton, who would wind up being the key government witness against Hoffa in his 1964 jury tampering trial in Chattanooga, Ed Parton told me, and Walter Sheridan, who discovered Parton, it was Walter who flipped him. Well, Walter introduced me to his people, not just to Ed, but to the Kennedy Justice Department people. It was a gold mine that Walter had given me as my adopted mentor. Anyway, Ed Parton had told me that Hoffa he was with Hoffa when a $250,000 contribution was made to Richard Nixon. It was a contribution that had been collected by Hoffa and a mafia guy in New Orleans named Carlos Marcello. And this money went to Richard Nixon because the mafia hated John Kennedy. They hated him. They hated Bobby Kennedy because, again, they were eating mafia guys for breakfast during the Senate Rackets Committee. And when he became Attorney General of the United States under his brother, he started eating them for lunch and dinner too. Bobby Kennedy was the greatest crime fighter this country has ever had, and the number one person on his hit list when he came to the Justice Department was Jimmy Hoffa. The head of the Get Hoffa squad was my mentor, Walter Sheridan. And it was Walter Sheridan who developed the cases, which ended up leading to Jimmy Hoffa's conviction in 1964 for jury tampering in Chattanooga as a result of a fix that he arranged in an extortion trial that he had in Nashville, where Ed Parton stepped forward and called Walter, and he said, I want you to know that Hoffa has fixed the jury in the Tesley extortion trial. This was stunning because Ed Parton was very much of an insider with Hoffa, and the question was, why are you flipping like this? Why, this guy trusts you. You're his doorkeeper at the Andrew Jackson Hotel, and which is where they stayed. Parton replied that he was having a conversation with Hoffa, and Hoffa wanted Parton, who was the head of the Teamsters Local 5 in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. He wanted him to set plastic explosives at Hickory Hill, Bobby Kennedy's home, and he wanted him to kill Bobby Kennedy and his entire family. That was stunning to Walter, obviously. Walter investigated Ed, polygraphed him, passed flying with colors and everything else. So they took this guy very seriously. He became their top witness against Hoffa, and it was Ed Parton who spread open the curtains during the jury tampering trial, sat down, took the oath to the horrified Hoffa, who said, "Oh my God!" It was a complete shock to everybody what Ed Parton had done. Ed Parton was one of my greatest sources as a result of being introduced to him by Walter. The Kennedys were targeting the mafia, and I can assure you the mafia was targeting the Kennedys. In September of 1962, when Ed Parton first told his story about the plastic explosives to Walter, um, Carlos Marcello allegedly had a meeting down in Churchill Farms, which is his estate down in near New Orleans. And he basically said, according to the FBI report, which came out before the president's murder, that if they decide to kill Bobby Kennedy the way Jimmy Hoffa wanted to, that everyone would know in 2 seconds who did it. They needed to make some distance. So they decided to kill the man, according to this report and this informant. They decided to kill the man who controlled the attorney general. They decided to kill the president. And then in that same month, in September of 1962, another mafia guy from Tampa, Florida, named Santo Trafficante, was having a conversation with an FBI informant. He did not know this was an FBI informant, but as the mafia boss of Tampa, he was a very respected guy in the state of Florida. He was involved in the CIA mafia plots to kill Castro in 1960, which started under Dwight Eisenhower, where there was a decision made to kill Castro. And they decided that they were going to use mafia guys for the purpose of helping them whack the beard. In my opinion, this was wholly corrupting to the CIA, and it completely diminished and tainted the CIA forever, as far as I'm concerned. Because once you let the mafia get involved in something that you're doing, it wrecks everything, because they're going to try to find an edge on everything they could, and they did in this particular situation, having indictments dropped, having cases quashed. What had happened was the CIA decides that they are going to this is the story that's known. This is the story that the Church Committee, chaired by Frank Church, who was on the Senate Rackets Committee with John Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy and John McClellan. The story that he came out with in their final report in 75, 76 was that the decision was made to kill Castro. The government, the CIA, had brought in a guy named Bob Mayhew, who later became a friend of mine. And he told me his story. Bob Mayhew brought in,
It was a former FBI guy who had
exactly.
a private started his own private kind of
and he was the top assistant to who?
Howard Hughes.
Howard Hughes, right. And so you've done your research. And so Mayhew knew that in order to deal with Cuba, he was going to have to get to Trafficante, who was a boss. Again, he was the boss of Tampa. But Mayhew did not know a boss. But he was acquainted with a mafia guy named Johnny Roselli. And so he was working with a guy named, I think his name was O'Connell from the CIA. He was an official there. I think he was a station chief or something like that. He worked with him. I think they had a personal friendship that went way back. And then he brings Roselli into the situation. Roselli then brings in Sam Giancana.
So just a little background. So Roselli was a Chicago mobster.
He was a Chicago soldier, right?
And he had spent time out in Los Angeles and Hollywood. He was a figure out in Las Vegas, which we have discussed earlier. A lot of the Vegas casinos and hotels, a significant part of their funding had come from the Teamsters Midwest Pension Fund.
Right. And he was like a soldier in the Chicago outfit. And he brought in Sam Giancana. Now they have an acting boss, not a boss like Tony Accardo, who was really the boss of of Chicago, but they had an acting boss like Sam Giancana. And through Giancana, they were able to bring in Santo Trafficante. What Castro had done was, where I come into this investigation is, and the church committee didn't even deal with this. When I started writing my book, The Hoffa Wars, I was introduced to this brilliant researcher named Mike Ewing. And Mike Ewing had been a Senate investigator, and he had done, some great work. And he said that he always wanted to investigate Hoffa and his possible role in the CIA Mafia plots, as well as his role in the JFK murder. So I was able to get a grant from the Fund for Investigative Journalism, the executive director of which, and the president of which, Milton Yoris, and the executive director, Howard Gray, introduced me to Mike. And I was able to, pay him so much less than he was worth, but I gave him the entire grant. And he was spectacular in what he came up with, as well as what he drew me out to use my talents to come out as well, with the interviews I did and everything else, as with Bob Mayhew. So so what had happened was, when prior to the revolution in Cuba, there was a lot of action going on, and Mafia guys basically controlled Fulgencio Batista, who was the president of Cuba.
And Meyer Lansky was an important figure in that.
Very important, very important. I would say that it was Meyer Lansky, as you pointed out. It was Meyer Lansky who was the one who really embraced Batista, who really corrupted him. When Castro came in, or was threatening to come in, the Mafia, seeing that Castro had a chance, they decided to ship arms and ammunition to not just to Batista, but to Castro as well. They wanted to hedge their bet to make sure that they were on the winning side, whoever took over. When in World War II, Italy, Vito Genovese, who had been deported to Italy, was helping to build the fascist party headquarters in Rome. But when it became clear that the Allied powers were going to turn the tide during World War II and towards victory, the Mafia started working in concert with the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, the forerunner to the CIA, with the United States Navy. And
you had a Operation Underworld with Meyer Lansky,
Lucky Luciano,
and Lucky Luciano interacting with naval intelligence to initially clear the docks of theoretical German saboteurs in New York, and then eventually, right, when the Allies invaded Sicily, which was their first invasion of Europe, at least from the West, there was some level of cooperation among Allied forces and local mafioso in Sicily.
Right, and that was arranged. That was arranged by the Mafia guys who were trying to curry favor with the United States government. As you pointed out, Lucky Luciano was involved. This guy was in prison for white slavery, and he got a pardon. He was pardoned. I think Thomas Dewey, the governor of New York, arranged this to happen, and he wound up being deported to Italy. And once he went to Italy, he teamed up with a guy named Frank Coppola. And Frank Coppola, as I mentioned earlier, was the Mafia guy who Jimmy Hoffa went to in order to run the CIO raiders out of Detroit. And Frank Coppola and Lucky Luciano got together, and they formed the first major international drug cartel, going from Sicily to Marseille to the French Connection, basically. And so the person who was connected to all of this was, because there were other Mafia guys involved in the pre-Castro takeover operation. There was a guy named, the boss of the Pittsburgh Mafia, a guy named John LaRocca. His underboss, a guy named Gabriel Pelli Manarino. And then there were two guys from the Lucchese crime family, two capos, Jimmy Plumeri and Sal Granello. And then there was a mafia boss in northeastern Pennsylvania named Russell Buffalino. And all of these guys were trying to get a $450,000 cachet that they had buried near the Havana airport. And they were working with mafia guys. They were working with government people. The one person that you could connect to LaRocca, Manarino, Brunello, Plumeri, and Buffalino is Jimmy Hoffa. While I was writing my book, there was a DEA agent named John Kidner who had talked about a guy named Cromaldi. He had written a book about a guy named Charles Cromaldi, who was a hitman in Chicago. And John and I became friends, and what I was particularly interested in was Kidner's that Cromaldi's claim that Jimmy Hoffa was the original liaison between the CIA and the Mafia. So Kidner arranged for me to. Cromaldi had already flipped and turned state's evidence. He was a world-class federal witness. He had been originally flipped by the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. And he was very respected as a guy who knew what he was talking with. I was close to one of the top guys, the assistant director of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. And he told me that anything that came out of Charles Cromaldi's mouth was absolutely true and accurate. I interviewed Cromaldi. I did not interview him in person. John had to, because of that Federal Witness Protection Program thing. I had to interview him over the phone. But he explained to me how Jimmy Hoffa was involved, was the original liaison between the CIA and the Mafia. And I didn't understand it until I learned about LaRocca and Manarino and Buffalino and Granello and Plumeri. I didn't understand that until I found out about these guys being involved in it. Because when you look at the church committee, there is nothing in the report about those guys. Nothing. They talk about Mayhew, Roselli, Giancana, Santo Traficante, who end up, missing. They don't get them. They don't get Castro. They don't get them. There's a lot of speculation on why they didn't get them, whether they were really trying to get them, or whether they were just using this to stretch this out to blackmail the government as long as they could. There was a big wiretapping case in Las Vegas. Giancana was having an affair with a famous singer named Phyllis McGuire, and he was a jealous guy. And he suspected that a comedian who was known as the co-host of the Rowan and Martin Laugh-In program, named Dan Rowan, that he was having an affair with his girlfriend. So Giancana contacted Roselli, who contacted Mayhew. Do you know somebody who can, do a surveillance thing on Rowan's room? Because that's where he thought their rendezvous were. And so Mayhew made the arrangements. And the surveillance expert did such a poor job of doing. In fact, he was tapping the phones, not bugging the hotel room. He was tapping the phones. It was discovered. The illegal surveillance operation was discovered. Everybody was arrested. And in the end, what ended up happening was this started to get some attention in Washington. I'm no fan of J. Edgar Hoover, the former FBI director, but I believe that he handled himself very well during this period of time, where he found out that there was some sort of a relationship between the CIA and the Mafia, which he was completely unaware of, I believe it, and that they were involved in some sort of a wiretapping case in Las Vegas, and there was consideration to drop the case. Hoover did his investigation, and he discovered during that investigation that Sam Giancana had another girlfriend, and her name was Judith Campbell. And through information that Hoover, and this breaks my heart to say this, but it turned out that the other person Judith Campbell was having an affair with was President Kennedy. Hoover went to John Kennedy, had a lunch with him, and he revealed, there's something going on between the CIA and the Mafia. Oh, by the way, one of the guys involved with the CIA is Sam Giancana, and he explained to him that he's also having an affair with Judith Campbell, who has made, a lot of calls to the White House, and the White House is making calls to her. The last call that came from the White House to her number was right after Hoover and John Kennedy had their meeting. Now, what did Bobby Kennedy and John Kennedy discuss after this? Because I'm sure that Bobby Kennedy went out of his mind when he heard that the CIA was working in concert with the Mafia. And when this was explained to him by Hoover, he went to the CIA and exploded with counsel, his name was Houston, and with other CIA officials who were there. And he said basically, if the United States government, the Central Intelligence, ever wants to go business with the Mafia, I assume that you will tell the Attorney General of the United States, who has been prosecuting these guys left and right. It was a blatant case of the Mafia trying to blackmail the White House to relent in their war against the Mafia and organized crime and labor racketeers like Jimmy Hoffa. So, as I say, in 1962, September of 1962, there's the threat that's revealed by Ed Parton about blowing up Bobby Kennedy's house. There is the meeting at Churchill Farms with Carlos Marcello, where they said, if we killed the Attorney General, everyone's going to know who did it. We're going to kill the guy who controls them and kill the president. And then there's a meeting with Santo Trafficani with a businessman named Jose Alemán, where they are discussing a Teamster pension fund loan that Hoffa's personally approved for them, I think for a construction project. And they start talking about, and again, this is reported before the murder. They start talking about the 1964 upcoming election. And Alemán saying, Kennedy's pretty popular, he's probably going to be reelected. And Trafficani says to him, and this is in the reports, no, Jose, he's going to be hit. And he made it clear, according to Alemán, and he testified to this, that Hoffa was making the arrangements for the president's murder. Now, Hoffa had been convicted in '64. He was still involved in his jury tampering. He was still jury tampering the extortion case at that time. And so when the president was murdered, I have no idea as to whether there was one gunman or two gunmen or three gunmen or eight gunmen. I don't know any of that because that crime scene is so messy. You asked me about the Robert Kennedy murder. I'm one of the world's experts on the Robert Kennedy murder, and the crime scene is very significant. JFK murder, I can't quite figure out the crime scene because it's so messy. But I can tell you this, that Lee Harvey Oswald, when he was growing up, the guy who was his guardian was a guy who worked for Carlos Marcello. That he was in the Air National Guard with Carlos Marcello's top aide, a guy named David Ferry. That he was connected to the Marcello family throughout his entire life, and that Jack Ruby, the guy who ends up silencing Lee Harvey Oswald, used to work at the Chicago Waste Handlers Union, which was run by Alan Dorfman's, the fiduciary manager of the Teamster Pension Fund's father, Red Dorfman, and whom Jimmy Hoffa Jr., who I was close to for 75 after his father disappeared in 76. And then in 77, we had this massive falling out after we were sitting there. I was in his office. We were talking. His law partner, Murray Chodak, was there. And it was 2 days after Christmas. My girlfriend lived in Detroit. And so we had gone to visit her parents. She and her mom were going shopping. I said, I'm going into town to see Jim. So while I'm sitting there, Jim says, "How's your book on my old man doing?" And I said, "Good, good." I got to tell you though, I'm going to allege in my book that your dad, along with Carlos Marcello, the mafia boss of New Orleans, and Santo Trafficani, the mafia boss of Tampa, arranged and executed the murder of the president in '60. And Bobby said, "Oh, Dan, that's such bullshit." He said, "Listen, my dad knew Jack Ruby, okay? But so what? He was the kind of guy everybody knew. And my dad wanted to kill Kennedy, he would have walked right up to him and blew his brains out." And I'm going, what is? So I take my notepad out of my pocket and I start writing to, he goes, "That's off the record." And I said, "Jim, look, you know the rule. You don't wait, you don't say something, wait to see my jaw hit the floor and then take it off the record." And he goes, "Murray, what did I just say?" So he points at Murray Chodak, and Murray says, "I didn't hear you say anything, Jim." He goes, "Yeah, what do you got? You got nothing." So a conversation deteriorated from that point on. And so I was walking to the elevator, and while I was walking to the elevator, I wrote the quote down. So when my book came, just before my book came out in '78, Playboy magazine had bought an excerpt to the book. And the executive editor at the time was a guy named Barry Golson. And Barry was my editor for this piece, this long, long excerpt from the Hoffa Wars. And so we had just put the piece to bed, and he said, "You want to go have breakfast?" It was like 2 o'clock in the morning. So we went out to some greasy spoon out on 2nd Avenue in Manhattan. And he says, "Well, it's such a great story." He says, "I just wish we had something, that could directly connect Oswald or Ruby to Hoffa." And I said, "Yeah, me too." I said, "The only thing I know is," and I told him a story about Jimmy Hoffa. He goes, "Did he say that?" And I said, "Yeah, he said it." He says, "You said that?" And I said, "Yes, sir, he said that." He said, "Did you write it down?" I said, "Yes, I did." And he said, why is that in the book? Why is that not our story?" And I said, "Well, Murray Chodak's going to say, he's going to side with Jim, and, it's going to be their word against mine." He goes, "Did he say it?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "You wrote it down?" I said, "I wrote it down." He says, "We're going back to the office right now. We're going to add it to the story." And then the book at that time had gone, half of the book had gone to the printer. And then the second half book was still available. The one chapter I had about the Kennedy assassination in that book was in the first part, so I couldn't put it in the text, so I made it an endnote in the second part. And we added that story about what Jimmy Hoffa had said to me. So then, as my book was coming out, the House Select Committee on Assassinations was doing its investigation. It was being run by Louis Stokes, the chairman from Ohio, Congressman Stokes from Ohio, and the chief counsel was the world's expert on the Mafia, a guy named G. Robert Blakey, who was responsible for writing the RICO legislation, which came out of the 1970 Omnibus Crime Act. Brilliant man. God bless him. He's done so much good in the world. And so here's my book coming out, and here's the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and here's Bob Blakey, this guy who's very interested in the Mafia, running the investigation. My book couldn't have come out at a better time. I mean, there on National Public Radio was covering gavel to gavel here coverage of the hearings, and they got a hold of my book somehow, and they started reading passages from my book, which was actually being testified, things that were being testified to. And they did this for like 5 straight days during the Mafia hearings. And then the House Select Committee on Assassinations came out with its final, and what I had alleged was Hoffa, Marcello, and Trafficani had done the job. And in the final report of the Select Committee in, I think it was July of '79, the committee concluded that, among others, that Carlos Marcello, Santo Trafficani, and Jimmy Hoffa had motive, means, and opportunity to kill the president. And then Bob Blakey, the chief counsel of the committee, said, "The mob did it. It's a historical fact," which is what I believe happened. I think it was a straight mob hit.
Right. So the extreme animosity between Hoffa and the Kennedys is well attested to And thank you for sharing your extremely compelling reporting of the issues related to the assassination. Of course, there are those with other views, but moving beyond the assassination itself, so Kennedy is assassinated, and then um, Hoffa then spends a period of time in prison. Is that correct?
Yeah, he was convicted twice. Bobby Kennedy stayed after his brother's murder. He stayed as Attorney General long enough to see Hoffa convicted on the jury tampering case in Chattanooga, and then in a second pension fraud case in Chicago. And as he was sentenced to 8 years in prison for in the aftermath of his conviction on the jury tampering case. And then after his conviction for pension fraud in Chicago, he was sentenced to another 5 years to run consecutively. So he was looking at 13 years in jail.
And he was eventually commuted by Richard Nixon, I believe. And so
it was on December 23rd, 1971. Richard Nixon was looking to curry favor with unions because he wasn't going to, not too many Republicans get a lot of union support. And he was trying to get some Teamster support because he was friendly with Frank Fitzsimmons, who was the person who replaced Jimmy Hoffa. It was Jimmy Hoffa's handpicked successor, Frank Fitzsimmons. When Hoffa went to jail in March of 1967, he went to Lewisburg Penitentiary. And while he was in jail, he remained as president of the Teamsters Union. But in July of 1971, there was a new convention. And even though you can serve while you're in prison, you can't run while you're in prison. And so Hoffa had to relent, give up the general presidency. Frank Fitzsimmons, his handpicked successor, who had been serving as a caretaker since 67, then stepped up, ran for president with Hoffa's blessing, was elected, and he became very close to Richard Nixon. And so in December, I think it was December 23rd, 1971, Richard Nixon commuted Jimmy Hoffa's sentence with a restriction, a proviso, that he not seek union office until 1980. And so Hoffa was released from jail, and he immediately tried to get the commutation restrictions lifted. He was going to court and everything else, but the government made it clear that if he violated those restrictions, for instance, if he ran for office, even if he ran for local office, that he would be sent back to prison to serve his entire 13-year sentence. So Hoffa still continued, to push, but at this point, there was, Hoffa had really centralized Teamster power in his own hand. It was kind of a decentralized union for many, many, many years. But when Hoffa came to power in 1957, he was elected president of the union. As a result of Hoffa being elected president of the union in 1957, the AFL-CIO, which had merged, threw him out, threw the Teamsters out of the labor organization. And so Hoffa was on his own. In 1961, after Bobby Kennedy and the Senate Rackus Committee had created a case for a board of monitors to supervise the Teamsters, and they were finally able to legally get this yoke out from under them. In 1961, Jimmy Hoffa rewrote the Constitution of the Teamsters Union, and he decided to centralize all power in his hands, where he would have the power, for instance, there were a lot of people who hated Jimmy Hoffa, rank and file reformers, people who were good people, pro-union people, anti-mafia people, who were challenging Hoffa, and they were taking over local unions. Hoffa, under the 61 Constitution, was able to take those local operations, those local unions, and was able to throw them into trusteeship. And they would come under the umbrella of the International. He was able to stop the mutiny that he thought was going on. And so by doing that, he was the focus point for mafia guys who needed favors. They would have to come to Jimmy Hoffa to do it. That's the way he ran. Yeah. In 67, when he leaves, and in July of 1971, when Frank Fitzsimmons, his handpicked successor, becomes president of Teamsters, Frank Fitzsimmons, he decentralize his power. He doesn't want all these things going on. So you have this executive board that serves at the Teamsters Union. There's the general president, there's the general secretary treasurer, and then you have the general executive board, executive council. They have their own fiefdoms out in the country where they're able to make their own deals with the mafia guys within their own jurisdictions. Everyone sort of liked this decentralized thing. Everything wasn't going through one guy. It was decentralized. Everyone was getting a piece of the action. Everyone was, enjoying the freedom to do what they had to do. When Hoffa decided he was going to try to get his conviction overturned, or he was going to try to get the commutation restrictions overturned, regardless, he was going to try to come back as president of the union. The general executive board had no heart, no interest in Hoffa coming back and centralizing power once again. And so what happened was Hoffa knew, the Teamsters Union at that time, they weren't like the UAW or the United Mine Workers Union. It wasn't one man, one vote. It wasn't like we're going to vote for our president. We're going to vote for our secretary treasurer. What happens is that every 5 years, they have a convention. The Teamsters have a convention. And this is no longer the case, but this was the case back then. What would happen is the delegates to the convention would be the ones who would select the general president, the general secretary treasurer, and the general executive board. But you had to be a delegate to the convention in order to be part of that, to number one, be a candidate, and number two, to be part of the selection process. So what Hoffa needed to do was he needed to get a position where in his local 299 in Detroit, where if he was a business agent or an officer's recording secretary, vice president, whatever, and his stooge, I shouldn't say that because I like Dave, his man in power in local 299, Dave Johnson, he was willing to step aside and allow Hoffa to become president of the union, but Hoffa knew that if he were to do that he would be sent back to jail. But he needed a position in the local union to get to the 1976 convention. And so, remember, the convention was in July 1971. That's where Frank Fitzsimmons is elected. 5 years later, 76, this is the convention where Hoffa was hoping that he would regain the power of the Teamsters Union. So it was in the midst of all of this that he seemed to be on the verge of defying this local. This is something that the local angle on this is what everybody misses on this thing. And this is one of my contributions to this case. When Hoffa disappeared, I had started investigating Hoffa and the Teamsters in December 1974, about 8 months before Hoffa disappeared.
And just what was how did you get interested in the Teamsters and Hoffa? Just your own personal story there.
I was an activist back in college. I was student body president at my undergraduate school, the University of Akron. And then I went to graduate school at Kent State University, which was about 12 miles away from Akron U. While I was in graduate school, I had run for office and failed to be elected. I was very much involved in the civil rights movement back at school. I had taught a course called Racism and Poverty in the Honors and Experimental College. And I studied Black history. I had a few courses in Black history where our professors, Elliot Rudwick and Augie Mayer, were two of the world's most respected guys on the civil rights movement. And they were both professors at Kent State. I needed a job. And so once again, I was very close to the Black United Students when I was student body president at the university. I went to a party and I met a man named Bill Ellis. And Mr. Ellis was the publisher of a newspaper called The Reporter, and it serviced the Black community in Northeastern Ohio. Mr. Ellis offered me my own column. I was going to be the token white guy at the Reporter, writing about whatever I wanted to. One day I got a call from he was an official with an organization called TURF, TURF, Teamsters United Rank and File. It was a Teamster reform organization. And he said, "Are you interested in, covering Mafia and the Teamsters?" And I said, "Sure, why not?" And so he said, so he met me, it was very cloak and dagger stuff. I met him on a dark street corner. I think it was like 3:15 on a morning on December 17th, 1974. He passed me this ledger book of Teamster pension fund loans. It was the actual ledger book. It was a copy of the ledger book from Teamster with, going to Las Vegas casinos and these real estate things and everything. So I went to Mr. Ellis and I said, "May I do this?" And he said, "Sure, go ahead." So I wrote an 8-part series called The Teamsters, the Mafia, and Their Pension Fund. And I wrote an 8-part series about it from January to, I think, at the end of March. I think I ended at the end of March. And I got, what did I expect to get from this? Nothing. But I got a call from a reporter from New York. And he was a great investigative journalist named John Quitney. And he was with the Wall Street Journal. And John said, "Listen, I just read your 8-part series about the Teamsters and the pension fund. I'm doing my own series for the Journal, a 3-parter on the same thing. And I was wondering, can you help me out here? And, I can't pay you, but I'd be honored." I had read his book, The Fountain Bed Conspiracy, and I thought I knew how important he was right. This is in the Woodward and Bernstein are just coming, into the public consciousness. Seymour Hersh, the gods of investigative, Denny Walsh, David Burnham, the gods of investigative journalism are just really coming out at that time. And here I am, just a kid, 24 years old in December 1974. And at 25 when I meet in March. My birthday's in February, so I am 25. I'm 25 at that time. And I meet John, and then I work with John, and John comes out with his 3-part series on July 22nd, 23rd, and 24th, 1975. And 1 week later, after John's 3-part series comes out, Jimmy Hoffa disappears on July 3rd. And everybody was interested. So John calls me up after we find out the day after that it's going on, that Hoffa's disappeared. And John calls me, he says, "What do you think?" And I said, "I don't know, what do you think?" And he says, "I don't know, what do you think?" And I said, "I think he's alive. I think he's alive, and and he said, "Where do you think he is?" And we went through this whole kit and caboodle where we came to this very logical conclusion that Hoffa was alive and well. And at Eagle River, Wisconsin, there was a big Mafia lodge up there, which was owned by Alan Dorfman. And so we decided we were going to go to Eagle River, Wisconsin. And so and John ended up writing the introduction to the paperback version of my book. And he tells this story about he and I meeting in Chicago at O'Hare. And then we take a Republic airline flight to Rhinelander in Wisconsin. And then we rent a car and we drive to Eagle River. And it ended up being fortified. It was armed guards there and everything else, but I got in. But I was caught. And I was taken at gunpoint into the lodge area where I met Rose Dorfman, Alan Dorfman's mother, and Jerry Weiner, who was the son of Irv Weiner, who was the Teamsters' top bail bondsman in the country. And Alan Dorfman was in Rome at the time, according to I got along well with them once I got in there, but it was clear that I had no business being there. And they said, "What are you?" And I said, "Well, I'm a graduate student at Kent State." And I had my little ID card from Kent State, and they sort of gave me a pass, but they wanted me to leave. They answered a few of my questions, but they wanted me out of there. I didn't have any business being there. And I got bit by a dog and everything else. Anyway, so Whitney and we ended up having fun that night. he goes back to take all the grief he's going to take from his fellow staff members at the Wall Street Journal on Monday. And I had $2 cash and a credit card in my pocket. So I hitchhiked. Once I had a plane ticket. I took the plane ticket, changed it for, instead of going back home to Akron, Ohio, which is where I live, I took it to Detroit. And then I hitchhiked from the Detroit airport to the Red Fox restaurant where Hoffa was last seen. I was not dressed for the place. It said, men must hold coat and tie. It said, there was a little plaque outside the door. And I was hardly dressed for entry to the Red Fox. When I went in, I was told to leave. I came back out. There's a priest there. I said to the priest, listen, my name's Dan Moldea. I'm a reporter trying to get in the restaurant, investigating the Hoffa case. They're not letting me stay in. And I was wondering, can I go in with you? They'll think I'm one of your wayward youths or something like that. They'll let me stay. And he starts laughing. He goes, sure, come on. And it turns out we were the same religion. We're both Eastern Orthodox. And so he accompanies me, or I accompany him into the Red Fox. And I said to the maitre d' who had just thrown me out, I said, I'm with him, pointing to the priest. And he starts laughing and says, okay. As I say, thank you, Father. And as I'm walking, Irving R. Levine, the great the labor and economics reporter for NBC News with the bow tie, he walks past me and he goes down this flight of stairs to this bank of payphones. So I said, Father, thank you very much. I go downstairs and there's like about maybe 6 payphones there. And the only one in use is the one that Irving R. Levine has in his hand. So I said, so I'm standing there and he's looking at me. He goes, can I help you? And I said, you need me. And he says, excuse me? And I said, you need me. He says, I need you. What do I need you for? I said, the Hoffa case. And he says, and he puts the phone down. He says, you know something about the case? And I said, I helped John Whitney in the 3-part series that he published in the Wall Street Journal last week. He goes, are you that graduate student from Kent State? And I said, yeah, it's me. He says, what are you doing for lunch? I said, no plans. So I go up there and the whole NBC crew and everybody's there having lunch at the Red Fox. And the producer is there, the field producer, Bob Toombs. And he starts giving me a trivia question test about like Hoffa and the Teamsters. I pass, and so they said, come along with us for our interviews this afternoon and let's see how it works out. And so I went and I never spoke to Levine. I always talked confidentially to Bob Toombs, the producer. I said, ask him about that. Tell him to ask him about it. We interviewed Joe Bain. We interviewed Lenny Schultz. And it looks like Lenny Schultz's house is where the murder was, and a couple other interviews. And I made a real contribution to the reporting that day. So we went to the Southfield Sheraton, which was a nice hotel in the area. And that's where they were staying. And they were handing out keys. And then I saw Levine and Bob Toombs talking to each other. And they were sort of looking at me. And I was just sort of there knowing the decision was being made. And then Bob Toombs just comes up to me and he says, you did a good job this afternoon. We want you with us. He hands me the key and he goes, kid, don't fuck up. And so I was thrilled. I was working with NBC. First day on the job. One of my sources says, I think I knew who killed Jimmy Hoffa. And I said, okay. And he comes to me through somebody I totally trust. And he starts telling me a story about this 32-member goon squad that is running around shaking down trucking companies, but that had been involved in some covert activities prior to Hoffa's murder. When Hoffa was trying to get back into the local
just a quick question. So is the Goon Squad connected to the Teamsters, or is it so the Goon Squad's a group of violent individuals who are committing crimes and violent intimidation on behalf of the Teamsters, or is it on behalf of the mob?
What had happened was in 1971, in July 1971, at the Teamsters convention, where Frank Fitzsimmons was elected in his own right as general president, there was a resolution that was passed. Really, it was innocuous. It was, show of hands, passed. But what it was it financed this special unit, this task force, to organize the unorganized and to go out and organize special commodities haulers, steel haulers, car haulers, people like that, workers like that. And Roland McMaster, who was a longtime ally of Hoffa going back to the Denny Lewis days in the CIO. They had been together all these years. But after Hoffa went to jail, and Frank Fitzsimmons was named as Hoffa's handpicked successor, Frank Fitzsimmons didn't want to, he was head of the Teamsters. He was Hoffa's handpicked successor for the Teamsters, but he didn't want to run like the local union, like Hoffa did, like the Joint Council, like the Central Conference of Teamsters. So what he tried to do is he wanted to designate the job. And so he designated the job to Roland McMaster. And Hoffa had problems with Master because A, he had been convicted of extortion, gone to jail. And B, he and McMaster hadn't been getting along that well. And so Hoffa was attempting to sabotage McMaster and getting this job as being the caretaker. They would call him administrative assistant, as being the caretaker of Local 299. And so during the next few years, especially after Hoffa was released in December of 1971, a year before the election, where Nixon was reelected, Hoffa had people who were very loyal to him in the local, but those people became the targets of some real acts of violence: beatings, bombings, shootings, general sabotage. And no one could figure out who was behind these things. They couldn't figure it out. There was this one guy named Coulter, I think, that they were trying to blame him for it. But so my source, who told me on my first day on the job at NBC, was it's McMaster who's behind. It's McMaster and his goon squad that's behind all of this. And I said, "How do you know this?" And he goes, "Because I was one of the goons. I was in the group." So NBC was definitely interested, but in the end, they ended up viewing it as a bottomless pit. And but I stayed on. The Hoffa case went cold. The Hoffa case went cold about a month later. I mean, it was white hot. It was, really going. And then
and at that time, like, what were the known facts about the last, say, several hours of Hoffa's life?
Good question.
Or at least before he disappeared, because people didn't know whether or not he had been murdered, or that no one knew anything. No one knew what happened. He just vanished, which made it such an enduring mystery in American pop culture and history. And so
what had happened was Hoffa was reported missing later on that night. In my opinion, my expert opinion, Hoffa was murdered, and he was underground 600 miles away by the time he was even reported missing. But what was known at that time, what came out over the next few days, was that Hoffa had gone to the Red Fox restaurant on Telegraph Road in Bloomfield Hills, a very beautiful area of suburb of Detroit. And he was waiting to have a meeting with Tony Giacalone, a Mafia guy in Detroit, and Tony Provenzano, who was a Mafia guy out of New Jersey. And he was also the longtime head, whether direct or not, of Local 560 in Union City, New Jersey.
And wasn't he a member of the Genovese, the New Jersey Genovese?
He was a capo in the Genovese crime family, and he was also related by marriage to Giacalone. And then the third person who Hoffa expected to meet, there was Hoffa's wife saw that he had on his appointment schedule, he had put Tony J, Tony P, and Lenny. So it was Tony Giacalone, even though he starts his name with a G, but he was known as Tony Jack. And then Tony Provenzano. And then Lenny Schultz, who was a local businessman who was loyal to Tony Giacalone. In fact, at the time of the kidnapping, the disappearance, Tony Giacalone was at the Southfield Athletic Club, where his name was constantly calling for Mr. Giacalone, and which was owned by Lenny Schultz, who was one of Tony Giacalone's stooges. As I said,
do we know the purpose of why he was it to try to get them to support his bid to retake control of the Teamsters, or they had some previous beef that they needed to discuss, or do we know the purpose of
there's many different scenarios as to what happened. The one I subscribe to is that Tony Pro and Hoffa had known each other. They had grown up and made their bones together, and they were friends. But once Hoffa went to Lewisburg Penitentiary, another inmate there was Tony Provenzano. And Provenzano and Hoffa got into a fight at the in the mess hall. One of my sources was also an inmate, a guy named Ed Edwards. One of my sources, Ed Edwards, was an eyewitness to the fight. He was one of Hoffa's unofficial bodyguards at that time. And it was a blood-curdling fight, and it was a blood feud that emerged from there, where these guys had a falling out that was never going to be patched up. Well, the talk is at this meeting at the Red Fox, where they were going to pick them up and take them someplace, and they would have their peace, make their peace, that here would be, but what Tony Provenzano wanted was the local 560 pension fund had been badly depleted by some bad investments. And they needed Hoffa's influence, even though he was out as president, he still had a lot of influence on the Teamsters pension fund. And they wanted an injection of money to the local 560 pension fund. Very complicated stuff. No one knew what happened. People were floundering at first. I was involved in this thing from day one. People were floundering. I had left NBC a month after, when everything had just gone cold. I mean, people were literally digging holes in farmyards and things like that, going for the reward that had been put up. I stayed on the McMaster thing and the 32-member Goon squad. I stayed on it. I thought I had something. When I went back to Ohio after I left NBC, they offered me a job to stay, and I didn't want it. I said, I think I can solve this thing. And so when I went home, I wrote a theory. This is what I think happened. Immediately, I was contacted by the FBI immediately. And they came to Akron to see me. They were there for 2 days. And I was doing this at the behest of my source, my task force source, the guy who was a member of the task force, who had given me this information on my first day of the job at NBC. And they were fascinated by this. They said, this plays right into everything that we know. Why don't you come back to Detroit? And I said, I don't have a job or anything like that. Just come back, somebody will pick you up. So I ended up going back to Detroit. And then through my friendship with Dave Johnson, who was Hoffa's caretaker at Local 299, I met Steve Riddle. Steve Riddle was Jimmy Hoffa's uncle. And he said, have you met Jimmy Jr., Jimmy Hoffa Jr.? And I said, no, haven't met him. He says, let me introduce you guys. So he introduced me to Jimmy Jr. And Jimmy was very nice to me, and he's a lawyer. And he said, what do you know? I heard you know something important. I told him the story about McMaster, and Hoffa was stunned. He was absolutely stunned. So he said, are you working for anybody right now? And I said, no, I left NBC, and they decided they weren't going to follow it up because they thought it was a bottomless pit. But I'm looking for somebody. And so Jimmy he's so impressed with what I've got. He cracks the Hoffa, he's the administrator for the Hoffa Reward Fund. And he cracks the Hoffa Reward Fund to give me a couple of $1,000s. And he says, listen, I have friends over at the Detroit Free Press. So he calls them up, first of all, he calls, when he hears my story, he says, are you free? Can you stay here for a little bit? And I said, sure. Without telling me, he picks up the phone, he calls the FBI. He says, I got a guy here I want you to talk to. They said, we'll be right on. And literally, 20 minutes later, two FBI guys walk into Jimmy's office, and I'm sitting there. And one of the FBI guys who's in is one of the guys who visited me in Ohio. And I'm looking at it, and I'm trying to figure out, how do we play this? Do I know you or don't I know you? And then when he was introduced us, he came over and he shook my hand. Nice to meet you. I said, nice to meet you too. So he said, tell him the story. So I told him the story about McMaster and the Goon Squad and the local 299 violence. And Jimmy says, what do you think? And the FBI guys say, one of them I know, one of them I don't. And the one who I don't know he was the boss. He says, I can't confirm everything that he's saying, but I can tell you that we are on the same track and we believe that his information is correct. So that's when Jimmy offered me the money, gave me the money for the Hoffa Reward Fund, and then he introduced me to the Detroit Free Press. And so I had an 8-month assignment with the Detroit Free Press for one job and one job only, and that was the 32-man Goon Squad that was directed by Jimmy Hoffa. That was my job. We were showing that they were shaking down trucking companies in return for labor
Directed
peace.
by McMaster, you mean?
Yeah. This is a wholly owned operation of the Teamsters, funded and operated by, with Roland McMaster, one of their top international organizers, as the director and engineer of this whole operation, whether it was for shaking down trucking companies or whether it was intimidating Hoffa supporters in local 299.
Because McMaster is at one point was a very strong ally of Hoffa, but later they had a falling out.
And a falling out after Hoffa went to jail in '67, and it was over Fitzsimmons' decision to make McMaster the administrative assistant and the titular head of Teamsters Local 299 in Detroit. That Hoffa objected to. Fitzsimmons defied him on that, kept McMaster on the job, and that's what caused the falling out, not only between McMaster and Hoffa, but it caused the falling out between Fitzsimmons and Hoffa. And so I believe that McMaster was right. To me, my whole theory was, if you find out who was behind the local 299 violence before Hoffa disappeared, which went right up to 20 days before the murder, when Dick Fitzsimmons' Union car was bombed outside of Nemo's restaurant near Tiger Stadium. I said, if you solve who's behind the local 299 violence, you solve the murder. Those are the guys who are behind the murder. And so the FBI guys didn't share my enthusiasm for all of that, but they were very helpful. I mean, again, I don't expect FBI guys to just say, here's what's going on and give me the whole thing. What I expect from them is when I tell them what I'm doing, I expect them to keep me on track. If I'm off track on something, for instance, the one guy would come up to me and he would say, so what are you up to? And I said, well, I'm investigating, the 299 violence. I'm investigating Alan Coulter, who was a suspect in this thing. I'm investigating an angle in New Jersey. He goes, keep the 299 violence, keep the New Jersey angle, get rid of the Coulter thing. That's not important. So they would keep me on track because I'm a poor writer. I'm a poor freelance writer. And God knows the Detroit Free Press wasn't paying me very much. And so he says, I want to take you to lunch. So he takes me to lunch. And this is the most I ever got out of an FBI agent. He says, you got any time? And I said, sure. I said, I'm going to take you on a tour of Detroit. Takes me in the car, starts showing me around. This is an FBI guy did. And he takes me to McMaster's home. And he says, you know where we are? And I said, I saw Telegraph Road out there, but where are we? He says, we're 5 minutes away from the Red Fox restaurant. I go, whoa. And then he takes me downtown to the Ramada Inn down there, which is, I forget the name of the hotel, it was like an apartment building and a hotel and it was owned by McMaster and his partners. And his goons were staying there. His goons were there, and they were there the week before Hoffa disappears. So I'm thinking, this Hoffa, it's McMaster. So much so that the two staff reporters I was working with the Detroit Free Press got pissed off at me because I just was not getting off the McMaster thing. They go, Dan, this is a mob thing, probably local Detroit mob guys, forget about McMaster. He's not a mob guy. He's a labor racketeer. So I'm telling you, McMaster is involved in this thing. So in December 3rd, 1975, I get a call from one of my sources, and they said there's going to be activity in Detroit tomorrow before the grand jury. And so we meet for a meeting, and Joe Thomas's sources were better than anybody and any reporter in Washington and in Detroit. And she says the grand jury tomorrow is going to be based on an informant named Ralph Picardo, who was part of the Provenzano operation. And they are going to be bringing at least four people into to the grand jury. And there's a fifth person who is unknown, is a mystery man who's not been identified. And the four people identified were two sets of brothers. One was Sal Bergoglio and Gabe Bergoglio, who were Sal Bergoglio was Tony Provenzano's top lieutenant at Local 560. And then the other brothers were Stephen and Thomas Andretta, and Stephen Andretta, like Sal Bergoglio, was right there, one of his Tony Pro's top lieutenants. Sal Bergoglio was a Mafia guy. He was a made Mafia guy. I don't think Steve was, and I know Tom wasn't, and I know Gabe wasn't, but I think Sal was made. And so, and he was working with Tony Pro, as you pointed out, who was a capo in the Genovese crime family. So at the grand jury, I'm clinically depressed because McMaster has not been named. And so I'm sitting in a newsroom. Joe Thomas is across the street at the federal building covering the grand jury. And I'm at my desk in the newsroom, and John Opadahl, who's our city editor, comes up to me and he goes, Dan, take one guess who the fifth guy is over the mystery at the grand jury. I'm out of my chair like a shot. I run down, they're waiting for the elevator, run down the steps, run across the street. And I go up to the grand jury, and there's McMaster. And I was kind of a jerk. I went, why in God's name would you be here? Because he knew I was on him. Why in God's name would you be here? Why doesn't tell me? And he looked at me like, and he was a scary guy.
This is McMaster himself.
McMaster 6'4", 260. He has a glass eye, bad dude. He's a real badass. Reputation as a leg breaker and everything else. And here I am messing with this guy. And I've talked to him a couple of times before. We talked telephone. This is the first time I met him face to face. He says, call me after the grand jury. I'll be home, and I'll tell you what happened. Right. So it was after that. And I talked to McMaster, and he gave me a song and dance. He said he took the fifth, as did the Bergoglio brothers, as did the Andretta brothers. Everyone took the fifth. And so that's when I had lunch with the FBI guy, and he gave me the car tour where he said, here's McMaster's house. And he says, and there's something else I got to tell you. Ralph Picardo, the informant, said that Hoffa was murdered in Detroit, stuffed into a 55-gallon drum, loaded onto a Gateway transportation truck, and shipped to New Jersey. So what had happened was about 5 days after Hoffa disappeared, Picardo, who was in jail for manslaughter in Trenton State Penitentiary, received a visitor in prison, and it was Steve Andretta, one of the alleged co-conspirators. And he told, during their conversation, Picardo said, geez, I heard Hoffa disappeared. And Steve gave him some details. Told him that Hoffa had been killed in Detroit, stuffed into a 55-gallon drum, loaded onto a Gateway transportation truck, and shipped to New Jersey. So here's Picardo, who's in jail for 20 years for manslaughter. So a few months later in November, early November of 75, he decides, what am I doing, man? He flips, makes a beeline to the nearest federal prosecutor, and he cuts himself a deal, goes into the WITSEC group. And the FBI says to him, did he say who murdered Hoffa? And he goes, no, he didn't tell me that, but I know from being with the Provenzano crew, he used to be Tony Pro's driver. Carter used to be Tony Pro's driver. He said, I know from being around them that Provenzano had given Sal Bergoglio a contract to kill Hoffa. But this was a couple of years ago. I don't know if the contract was still in effect or what. And he said, did he say where he took him when they took him to Jersey, when the Gateway truck took him to Jersey? And he said, no, but also I know from being with the Picardo, the Provenzano people, that when they killed somebody, they would put them in Brother Moscato's dump. And Brother Moscato's dump is a landfill under the Pulaski Skyway, which connects a bridge that connects Jersey City and Newark and the Marion section of Jersey City. And he said that when we killed somebody, the bodies would be buried there at the dump. And Brother Moscato was a Mafia guy, a Genovese guy. He was not a capo like Tony Pro. He was a soldier. So he was beholden to Tony Pro. And but he owned this dump, this toxic waste stuff that was, it was wild dogs, rats. It was hell on earth there, toxic waste coming out of the ground. It ended up being the target of a EPA Superfund. It was an EPA Superfund site for cleanup. The FBI had gone and executed a search warrant at Brother Moscato's dump in mid-December of 75, but they didn't know where to look. It's like 40 some acres, again, it's hell on earth there. And they didn't know where to begin looking in this place. So they dropped the thing, and it dropped, and it ended up. So I ended up doing my story for the Detroit Free Press on the Master Goon Squad. It came out in June 20th of 1976. And then a month later, I had friends in Washington who worked for Jack Anderson, the great Pulitzer Prize winning columnist. And Jack asked me to do some work for him. And one of the things he asked me to do was tell him the story about the local 299 violence in McMaster. So I gave him that information. He published it with credited to me in the story on the first anniversary of Hoffa's murder on July 30th, 1976. So then I was offered a deal with Rolling Stone to do a magazine article, and I decided, okay, so I know the Midwest part of this thing, Detroit. Now, New Jersey, I don't know so well, so I went to Jersey. And while I was in Jersey, I picked up the phone and I called Local 560 and I asked to speak with Sal Bergoglio. And he got on the phone, and nobody had talked to this guy. No reporter had. I'm sure plenty of attorneys did, but no reporters. And he said, who are you? I said, I'm a reporter. I work with Jack Anderson. I'm doing a story for Rolling Stone. And, I want to talk to you about the Hoffa case. And he says, what makes you think I know anything about that? And I said, because, Mr. Bergoglio, you've neither been arrested nor indicted. Everyone's blaming you for murdering Jimmy Hoffa. And I think the government is violating your civil rights. Now, I've never met a Mafia guy who's not against wiretapping. I've never met a Mafia guy who's not in favor of strong personal privacy laws. And I've been bored for hours by Mafia guys whining about the alleged impingements upon the rights and freedoms by the FBI and the IRS. He says, come on up. So I go up there, Local 560, and I'm in the waiting room, and Bergoglio comes in. He was sort of medium height, really kind of a wiry guy. And he's also coming in with Bill Buffalino. And Bill Buffalino was his attorney. And
wasn't he also Jimmy Hoffa's attorney?
He was, yes. He was his attorney during the Tesley trial, which was the extortion trial in Nashville, which wound up being where Hoffa ended up tampering with the jury, which led to his indictment for jury tampering, and the trial of which was in Chattanooga. Bill Buffalino was one of them. He had his own local there. I think it was local 945 or something like that. I think he ran the jukebox local there. I think that he was the he was everybody's attorney in the Detroit milieu of Teamster operations. And so I had met him while I was with NBC, and he was very nice to me. And he said, Danny, you know, we're going to go across the street to lunch. You want to come with us? And I said, yeah, sure. You know, I'm honored to meet you. And you know, said to Bergoglio, who was just sort of sizing me up, trying to figure out, you know, I'm 26 years old at the time. You know, who is this guy? And so we go down, and for some reason it was a holiday. It was October 25th, 1976. For some reason, there were very few people. We go down into the elevator. The elevator opens up in an empty garage. There was one car there. It was a Buick LeSabre. It was like a white Buick LeSabre, two-door. So it's Bergoglio's car. So Bergoglio gets behind the wheel. Bill Buffalino is going to take the passenger seat and then push ahead the seat so I can go in the back seat. So I'm in the back seat with Sal Bergoglio driving and Bill Buffalino in the passenger seat. And we go right out to across the street. There's a restaurant right across the street there. And he gives the car to the valet. We walk into the restaurant. We walk back into what is a private room. And there is Gabe Bergoglio and Stevie Andretti. And I know I am about to get the interview that everybody wants and nobody could get. And that was the exclusive interview with the alleged killers of Jimmy Hoffa. Tom Andretta was not there, but what had happened was I interviewed Gabe Bergoglio during the lunch because he had to go. He had something he had to do. So he splits. I interviewed Gabe, and then he splits. And then Sal, Steve, Bill, me, we go into Union 60 up to the president's office. I think the president at the time was Nunzio Provenzano, Tony Provenzano's brother. And Provenzano's other brother was there. And so it was the five of us. It was Steve, Sal, Bill, Provenzano, and me. And I had a tape recorder. And they allowed me to turn the tape recorder on, and I recorded the conversation for 3.5 hours. At the end of it, where I asked them everything. And where of course they deny it. But I also caught them in some real lies about their whereabouts at the time of the murder, where they claimed they were all in Jersey. And so at the end of the conversation, Steve volunteered. He said, "You want to talk to my brother?" And I said, "Yeah." So he gets him on the phone, and I interviewed Tom for about 20 minutes on the phone before we end up parting company. That was really quite a day. That was really quite a day where I was just very proud of what had happened. The Rolling Stone story never was published. And long story. And but I was right there in the middle of all of this. So fast forward, in 2007, I'm doing an investigation of a crooked judge down in Florida with my friend David Korn, who at the time was the Washington editor of The Nation. Now he's Washington editor of Mother Jones, one of the finest reporters here in Washington. And David's a friend. And he and I were investigating this crooked judge who was allegedly receiving payoffs from Mafia guys, so much so that he had been impeached by the U.S. House for corruption, and he was convicted by the United States Senate and removed from the bench. That judge was L.C. Hastings. And L.C. Hastings wound up, as a sidebar, he ended up running for Congress and serving 16 terms as a congressman from his district in Florida. Anyway, as I was going through the documents on the impeachment and conviction, the trial and conviction of L.C. Hastings, I came across the name of the Mafia guy who had made the payoffs allegedly to Hastings. And his name was Philip Moscato, the guy who owned Philip Moscato's dump in Jersey City, New Jersey, where, according to Ralph Picardo, his speculation, didn't know as a fact, Steve Andretta didn't tell him during their meeting 5 days after Hoffa disappeared, but it was his speculation that Hoffa was murdered and he was buried there at Moscato's dump, where the Genovese crowd and the Provenzano crowd had buried so many bodies in the past. So David said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I'm going to call him." So I picked up the phone, I called Moscato, and I said, "Listen, I'm here doing an investigation of Elsie Hastings. And I knew you knew him. I knew your name came up during the trial, at the Senate trial, where he was convicted. And I was wondering if I could talk to you about all this." And he said, "Sure, come on up." So he invites me up to his house up in Jersey. This is a soldier in the Vito Genovese crime family. So I drive up there. I get there very early. His wife makes us breakfast. He has a darling wife, and he's a nice guy. He really was quite a guy. He was a very sincere guy. He was an honest guy, and he lets me put the tape recorder on. I got the tape recorder on between us, and as we're talking about Elsie Hastings, I said, "The first time I heard of you was from the Hoffa case." And he goes, "Yeah, you wrote that book, right? That book about Hoffa, right?" And I said, "Yeah, I wrote a book called The Hoffa Wars, came out in '78. And I said, "So tell me, what happened?" He goes, "Well, essentially," he says, "the body's at my dump." And I got the tape recorder on. And so I said, I have no poker face in a moment like this. My mouth, as with Jimmy Hoffa telling me that his dad knew Jack Ruby, my mouth hits the floor. And I could see the look on Moscato where he's saying, "Should I have said that to you?" And I was ready to take my tape recorder and just tuck it under my arm like a football and run out in my car and make my way to the New Jersey Turnpike. Anyway, I ended up staying. We spent the day together. And this is another guy who gave me information with the frequency that a kosher butcher sells pork chops. And but he did. I stayed in touch with him over a period of 7 years till he died. Never betrayed him, never ratted him out, never wrote about him. I told him I would write about him after he was gone. And I could use the tapes that I had. So, but he told me that in Act 1, see, Hoffa's murder was a 3-act drama with different characters in each act. Act 1, Hoffa's picked up, persons unknown, driven to unknown place. Act 2, where he's murdered. Act 3, he's shipped someplace where his body's destroyed, or he's buried, or whatever. So there's the pickup, the scene of the crime, and the disposal of the body. So Moscato tells me that Hoffa was picked up by Vito Giacalone, who was the brother of Tony Giacalone, the Detroit gangster who Hoffa was expected to meet that day at the Red Fox. Vito Giacalone. Vito and Tony had been visiting Hoffa routinely. They were trying to set this thing up with Tony Pro. He told me that in Act 2, it was in fact Sal Bergoglio who killed Hoffa, and he was very close to Sal Bergoglio. Was like his best friend. But Sal, after I interviewed Sal in October of 1976, I interviewed him 3 more times. The last time I interviewed him was in February of 1978. And then 1 month later, on March 21st, 1978, he's coming out of a social club in Little Italy in New York. He gets 2 guys approach him, knock him to the ground, and shoot him in the face, like 6 times or something like that, and kill him. So Sal's gone. Moscato tells me that Sal did the murder. Vito Giacalone picks up Hoffa. Sal did the murder, and the body's at my dump. I'm constantly, right up to the day of his death, I'm like on the phone trying to get this guy who's dying and was surrounded by his family to give me the final solution as to what happened. And I got to tell you, I thought if he knew it, he would have told it to me. But I had a feeling he didn't know it. So in 2015, I wrote, he died in 2014, in February 2014. On July 30th, 2015, I wrote my 40th anniversary story about Jimmy Hoffa's murder, revealing what Phil Moscato had told me based on my recordings. So the story got a lot of attention. We had nothing. Where do you go? We're like where the FBI is. You got a 40 acre toxic waste dump, which has now been cleaned up by the EPA. Is Hoffa's body even there? If he's in that drum, the drum's been removed. So I had a friend. I had a friendship with a guy named Eric Shawn at Fox News, and Eric had interviewed a guy in 2001 named Frank Sheeran. Frank Sheeran was a Teamster official who was very, very close to Jimmy Hoffa. And he was also very, very close to Russell Buffalino, the Mafia guy from northeastern Pennsylvania, who was involved in the CIA Mafia plots to kill Castro, according to the Mafia guy, Charlie Cromaldi, who explained this all to me. Sheeran was coming out with a book. His co-author was a guy named Charlie Brandt, very talented writer named Charlie Brandt, former prosecutor for the state of Delaware. And he had represented Sheeran on some things he was doing. And Martin Scorsese and Robert De Niro had decided they were going to make a movie about Sheeran's story called The Irish. Eric was really the guy who was the driving force behind all of this. It was Eric who really supercharged Charlie and Sheeran's book, really supercharged it when the book came out, and was appropriate. And to his credit, Eric came to me and said, "I want you to read this book because I want your comment on what you think of this book as, one of the world's experts on this case. I want you to know, I want to know what you think." And he made me sign an NDA, which was fine. I signed the NDA, and I was impressed. I was impressed. I had known about Sheeran for years. In fact, I even interviewed him the week after. Sal Bergoglio was murdered on March 21st, 1978. I interviewed Frank Sheeran on March 28th, 1978, 1 week later, after Sal got clipped. And according to Charlie's book, it was Frank Sheeran who killed Sal Bergoglio. I never believed but he was also claiming that he had killed Hoffa himself. And I knew that was bullshit. There's no way that it's Charlie Brandt and his story that Frank Sheeran kills Hoffa. No way. No way that he killed Sal Bergoglio. No way that he killed Joey Gallo, who was also one of the celebrity murders that he claimed. This guy, according to him, was a one-man crime wave. None of it was true, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many others who studied this, including his own lawyers. In fact, I got a letter in March of '79. I got a letter from Frank Sheeran's, one of his attorneys, who was a former DA in Philadelphia, and he threatened to sue me for alleging that Frank Sheeran was part of the conspiracy, that he was possibly an eyewitness to the murder. He said Frank Sheeran wasn't even in Detroit that day. And here it is, fast forward. Now he's saying he was not only in Detroit, but he was the guy who actually killed Hoffa. So Eric Shawn from Fox interviewed me as the naysayer. I was the fly in the ointment for his program. And there were some very interesting things in the book. Sheeran knew some stuff. He really did. Meantime, Eric had me on a show right after, I think it was after Tommy Andretta died in Las Vegas. And I was on Fox, God forgive me. And they were beating Eric and his investigator, another very talented guy. We're beating the tambourine for Sheeran did this murder. And I said, listen, I interviewed, Brother Moscato, Bill Moscato, and he told me that the body, and I wrote this up for the anniversary of 2015, that, Hoffa is in Moscato's stuff. He was murdered by Sal Bergoglio, and he's in Moscato's stuff. But again, I had nothing to back it up. So as I'm driving home from the studio, I get a call. And I get a call from a guy named Paul Coppola. And Paul Coppola is the son, the youngest son of Paul Coppola Sr., who was Brother Moscato's partner at Brother Moscato's dump. It was the official name of Brother Moscato's dump was PJP Landfill. Phil, John, Paul, PJP Landfill, Phil Moscato, John, I forget his name. He was just a cutout. It was a political hack who smoothed out some of the problems they would have. And then Paul, who was the day-to-day manager of the dump. And Paul Coppola Jr. told me, he says, you know, I just saw you on TV and I want you to know, I think my brother knows something. My oldest brother. I said, who's he? He said, Frank Coppola. Now there's Frank Coppola, who was helping Jimmy Hoffa and went to Italy and had formed the major international narcotics network with Lucky Luciano. And then there's this Frank Coppola. That Frank Coppola spells his name different than this Frank Coppola. Frank Coppola, I said to the brother, I said, well, introduce me to him. I like to talk to him. So it takes me about 7 months to finally get a hold of this guy where he's going to talk to me. And on our first phone conversation, he gives up everything. He says that his father was the partner of Phil Moscato at PJP, Moscato's dump, and that his father had been given the task of burying Hoffa. I interviewed him, I think, 7 times during the course of September 2019. Never changed the fact, never changed anything. I'm believing this guy. And I said, we got to talk, we got to meet. So I go up to New Jersey. He's in, I pay for his way. I pay for him to fly from Florida, where he lives, to New Jersey, where his girlfriend is, and he visits her frequently. And so I stay in Secaucus, and his girlfriend and Frank and I meet at this restaurant, and we're talking, and I like the guy. He's a gangster, you know. He's had quite a record. He's been in prison, mobbed up, and there was this one particular mafia guy who was a very scary guy who he worked for, and he was gone. He was dead at that time, and so Frank says, you know, I haven't been back to the dump in years, and I'm thinking about going tomorrow. And I go, motherfucker, taking me with you. You want to go? And I go, well, yeah, that's what I'm here for. So the next day he picks me up at my hotel. We drive to the Moscato's dump. So he takes me on a 45-minute tour of the area. Moscato's dump, or the EPA, I was clinically depressed when I heard, you know, from Phil that the body was buried at the dump, because the body would be gone. The EPA would have cleaned it out. It was a wildlife preserve when I was there. But then Frank then turns around. We go to the dump, and then we turn around. And we come back under the alcove. There's an alcove under the bridge, under the Pulaski Skyway. And he's looking around. He's looking around. I got this all on film. And he's looking around. He goes, "This is it. This is where my dad buried Hoffa." He says that his dad buried Hoffa. He said that on the night, it was this night, I'm presuming it was July 30th, a black limo pulls up, and Frank was a worker there. He was, he was a grunt there working at the dump, and make money for, high school stuff. And he remembers a limo coming up, and he remembers talking to the guy in the limo. Then he comes in, and Moscato says, he sees Moscato and his father talking. He doesn't know what they're saying. And then later that night, he sees a hole that's been dug under the bridge. The bridge was in the alcove of the bridge. And this alcove was where Moscato's dump had their office. They had their office in a trailer. So Frank told me that on his deathbed, his father told him that Moscato had given him the assignment to bury Hoffa, that it was Hoffa's body they were bringing in. That Paul Coppola was furious that Moscato said, I got to be away. I can't be part of this. It's on you, Paul. You got to handle this. So in retaliation, instead of burying the body at the dump mercifully, where the EPA had cleaned up, he ended up burying it under the alcove where the on state property, anything on the bridge or under the bridge is controlled by the Department of Transportation for the state of New Jersey. And so he buries the body there. He buries it in the drum, in a 55-gallon drum, and then he gets, with a front loader, he gets 15 to 30 steel barrels, and he puts them on top of this barrel. So I'm not just looking for one barrel at the bottom of the hole. I'm looking for a sheet of metal. And each of these barrels is filled with toxic waste, adhesives, as I recall. So Frank has blown me away. I got all this on tape. Then I go home and I go to his house, girlfriend's house, and then I interview him for a long time. And sticks to the story, you know. And so I asked him to execute a sworn statement. He does. Execute a sworn statement under penalty of perjury. This is what my dad told me. And blah, 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 blah. 55-gallon drum, bottom of the hole, barrels on top. So, and Frank didn't, you know, Moscato never asked me for anything. And Frank never asked me for anything. But I said to him, listen, this is worth something to you. You know, you're a civilian coming in. I know you've got these connections, and I know you've done time, and I know you've been with some bad guys, but this is worth something to you. This is legitimate money here. I said, let me try to help you on this. And so I contacted a friend of mine in Hollywood, and he had a small production company, and I've done business with him before. I knew I could trust him. So I brought him in, and he became our team captain. And without dragging this thing out even further, we wound up with we had brought Fox News into this. I had brought Fox News into this, to my chagrin. And I liked Eric, but I couldn't stand Fox News. And trying to think how I can put this diplomatically. They were very excited about coming, and they were going to pay for the ground penetrating radar. And part of their operation was to get rid of when you go to the alcove under the bridge, so it's a fairly small area. It's about the size of a little league infield. 60 by 60 by 60 by 60 by 60. And so across the road from the Department of Transportation is a company, a waste management company. And they park their vehicles in the alcove. And the alcove was just packed with these vehicles, big dumpsters, 7 feet high, 20 feet long. I mean, steel, heavy steel. And we were bringing Fox News, and one of the things they had to do was clean this place out. We needed this place cleaned out, and it wasn't. So that day, they had to. We didn't have any choice. We had to go with what we had. There were these little inlets, these little aisleways between the dumpsters, and so we would just the ground penetrating radar, and sure enough, he catches something. He catches an edge of a something. And what he claims, what he assumed were barrels. So we called Interstate in, and they took away some of the dumpsters. And it was a 12-foot area, and then it went about 3 feet this way. Then there was a dumpster. Now, when they removed the dumpster, it was 12 feet here, and then it went 15 feet here. So. And according to the GPR guy, the ground penetrating radar guy with his equipment, he concluded that these are barrels. We thought we had, so we lucked out. We thought we had lucked out. So I called the FBI. I had been working, the FBI had contacted me in September of 2020 after Frank died. Frank had died in March of 2020. just as COVID was starting. He went in with a respiratory problem. The last time I saw him in January, he was carrying all this stuff. He had a very serious respiratory thing, and it killed him in March 16th of 2020. And so the FBI finally gets around to calling me in September of 2020. And he said, listen, we're very interested in what's going on. You know, what can you tell us? I'm 74 years old right now. I was 70 in 2020. I was 70. And you know, this is it for me, man. This is my last roundup. And this is use it or lose it time. And so I told the FBI, I told them whatever, I answered every question they had. I created a web page for them with pictures and videos and documents and everything they needed. I had on this thing, and and then they called me and they said, we want you to appear up here at the Newark field office. So in March of 2021, I went up there, and there was this, they had of the Detroit. See, Newark is the closest one to Moscato's dump. They're like 10 minutes away from the dump, but it's the Detroit office that runs the Hoffa case. It's the FBI special agent in charge of the Hoffa cases in Detroit. And anything that would happen, it would have to be authorized by him. And then it would go down to and I was the guy who called me in September of 2020 was a mid-level guy, had really no decision-making problem, but I'm a loyal guy, and I stayed loyal to the guy who brought me to the big dance. I stayed loyal to him, even though he didn't tell me anything, even though he, pissed me off a lot because he was letting me go off track. Like my old FBI guys, they would always keep me on track. This guy, he would let me go off track. And, but he was, I stayed loyal. I wasn't dealing with the guy in Detroit who called me. When he called me, I answered his questions and then went back to my guy in Jersey. So the FBI, we have this meeting at the Newark field office, and I'm walking around like a lounge act in Vegas, doing my thing, what I'm doing for you here. I'm on my feet, walking around, telling him this story. And they were fascinated. They're really fast. The main guy from Detroit was there. The U.S. attorney from Michigan was there. Almost the entire field office of the FBI for Newark was there, including my guy, who I was loyal to, and an assistant U.S. attorney, a legend in New Jersey law enforcement, was there. And he was he knew Ralph Picardo. Again, I'm piggybacking on a lead that the FBI got in 1975 from Ralph Picardo. And the guy I'm next to, he was the only guy who was older than me in that room. He interviewed Ralph Picardo. And he was all in on this thing with me. He was my biggest supporter through the whole thing. And then we got in cars and we drove down to the alcove. And I gave like Frank gave me a tour, I gave them a tour, culminating with the alcove. So we waited. But the deal was I was supposed to be there. That was the deal. So then I find out in, I think it was late October of 2021, that the FBI had filed an affidavit with the federal court, and that a federal judge had determined that probable cause existed that Jimmy Hoffa was in that alcove under the Pulaski Skyway. And he authorized a search warrant. So we didn't know exactly what they found. Again, my guy doesn't tell me anything, but he confirmed that this search had taken place. So I went up there a couple of weeks later with the New York Times. I brought the New York Times with me, and an investigator. And there had been some shenanigans going on up there. There were somebody was messing with the soil up there. There was a big mound that we found up there, and that's not supposed to be there. And again, nothing should be buried in that spot. This should be pristine. This is state property. The dump is over there. All the stuff that was buried was over there. Nothing should be buried here. So, because we had seen something possibly illegal going on, and plus we were seeing cameras
at the alleged burial site.
in the alcove. We saw cameras. And so we, through our own surveillance, we were able to see a couple of days after that was the last time I was there, it was in November of 2021. We were able to see on November 16th, 2021, somebody was doing a GPR. They had a very sophisticated looking machine and everything. We figured it was the FBI, but they said it wasn't them. So I go, oh, Jesus, what the hell's going on here? So then it was coming into the 2022, and there was another guy I was working with in Jersey, and he was one of Frank Coppola's best friends when they were growing up. This guy's not a gangster. He was a successful businessman. And he said to me, I had brought him early on. After Frank died, I met him. We got to be friends. And, he was our guy. He was our go-to guy in Jersey City. He would take time from his very successful business to go down the alcove and see what was going on, take pictures, take videos, and everything else. So his name was Bob Burke. And so Bob and I had dinner. Well, I went back up to Secaucus. For some reason, I was up there. I guess I was up there for that last trip in November of 2021. And he's told me that, I'm sorry, this is after that. We were he came to Washington, right? He came to Washington, and while we were talking at a restaurant here in Washington, he told me that it was his people on November 16th, 2021, who were doing the GPR with this very sophisticated. It was a friend of his who owned a construction company, and that the construction company was had a ground penetrating radar division, and that they had determined. We knew that the spot that Fox had discovered there was nothing there. It was something else was there, a water pipe or something like that that was mistaken to be a barrel. These guys with this company that Bob brought in called NAPCO, they found with their GPR technician on November 16th showed barrels. I've seen the scans. And
how far was this from the original mistaken site? Was it relatively nearby?
Probably about 20 feet. I'd say it was about 20 feet away. And so, good question, because obviously we were very concerned about that. And it was in a different direction too. Anyway, and the reason why he had called me, this was in April of 2022, he called me to tell me that the GPR guy who found the barrels from NAPCO construction company and their GPR unit was not the guy who had done the GPR test that they had, I think it was on April 16th, 2022, where a different GPR technician, and NAPCO told him nothing about what was found. He just went out and he found the exact same location. The exact same location. So when the FBI called the guy from Detroit, the guy who runs the investigation, when he called me, the person he wanted me to talk to was when I did my floor show, my lounge act at Newark in March of 2021, I was talking about Bob Burke, who was Frank's friend. And so the FBI guy who ran the Hoffa investigation called me, who I met at just a sidebar. While I was at the meeting, I had brought them a gift. And my gift was I had 3 tapes of the 3.5 hours of interviews I had with office killers, alleged killers, because all the government ever got out of these guys was the 5th. And here I got 3.5 hours of interviews. So I give the tapes to my guy, my no power mid-level guy who doesn't tell me,
In the FBI.
because I want to see who he gives it to. Because I know whoever he gives that to is going to be the guy who runs everything. And he gives it to the guy from Detroit. And then that guy from Detroit that calls me after meeting, I want to meet Bob Berg. So I introduce, and they hit it off. Bob's a very friendly guy. And they hit it off and become friendly. And they talk. And so when the NAPCO thing was not my thing, that was Bob's thing. Bob was loyal to me, and he was part of my team, and he stayed loyal to me, would tell me everything. They wanted to keep me, they wanted to give me, what is it when you don't want to tell somebody because you don't want to get them into trouble. And so he gave the scans to the FBI guy in Detroit. Now, the guy we were working with is the guy who was doing it. He was the one getting the search warrants. He was the one, getting the equipment there and everything else. And he was in the dark on this. I didn't know what was going on. Bob is doing his own thing. He gives it to the Detroit guy. So then the next thing, and then the New York Times writes this huge story, two big stories. And during a period of 3 days, I had my picture in the New York Times twice. Once was on A2. And we knew if we found this thing, and the Times was very interested in this. In fact, they brought the head of NAPCO, the construction company, and Bob into the New York Times offices in downtown Manhattan. They wanted to question him themselves, the editors and everything else. And they all thought that this was real. I knew it was real. They were pretty sure it was real. And so then that was they had the second scan in April of 2022. And then in July 1st, it was July 1st, 2022, a friend of mine calls me from National Public Radio. And he said, we've just interviewed a guy, Dan, and from the Justice Department. And I said to him, what do you think of what Dan's doing on Hoffa and the alcove? He goes, that's all over with. The FBI search, it's nothing. And I said, what? He said, yeah, that's what I heard. So I called my FBI guy up in Newark, the guy I'm loyal to. And I said, hey, I just got a call from a friend of mine that says, you guys have searched there, you guys have dug here, and it's over. When did this happen? And he says, we'll talk about it on Tuesday. I said, no, we're talking about it now. You put me out here. I'm hanging out to dry here. I want to know right now what's going on. And he doesn't tell me much, but it's clear that in early June, a whole month earlier, these guys had gotten a search warrant from the judge, probable cause officer, and they had dug the place up, much of the place up. And I said, what about the NAPCO spot? And he said, what's NAPCO? I said, that's our GPR. We gave you guys the very specific specs onto where the barrels were. He says, oh, we dug there and there's nothing here. So I called Bob up and I said, listen, Bob, so-and-so from the FBI saying they dug there, nothing's there. Would you do me a favor, go down, take pictures, take videos. I want the spot. I want to see the spot. So he goes out the next day, pictures, videos, sends it to me. It's pristine. There's not even let alone an excavator there. There's not even a shovel that's put in this thing. I called my FBI guy and I said, listen, I've got pictures and videos here right now of the exact spot. You guys didn't touch it. You didn't even come near it. I mean, I think it's wonderful that you dug the whole place up, but you didn't dig where we told you to dig based on our GPR results. So he sets up, he says, I'm going to turn this over to Detroit. So I get a call from Detroit. And they said, we're going to talk to you. And they talked to the team captain, the guy from Hollywood. His name was Bo Carson. And the two of us were on the phone with the FBI doing a Zoom about everything that was going on. And I said, you guys did not touch this spot. And they said, well, we GPR'd it. I said, if you GPR'd that spot, then you would have found exactly what NAPCO found. And so they pretty much have admitted they missed the spot. They have missed it. This is like 2 years plus ago, where I've been sitting here waiting for them to go back and atone for their mistake. I mean, this is something that's not like, my construction company, the NAPCO guys, we're all part of the same team right now. It's not like I got to fly them in from California. They're right there in Jersey. The field office of the FBI is 10, 15 minutes away from the spot. They could do this on their lunch hour. And so we are, right now, we are waiting. We've been given a green light, but we, not just by the FBI, but by the Department of Transportation. And we are just waiting right now for some construction work, which has nothing to do with this, to be completed. And so that's kind of what we're waiting for right now. So we're still in play on this thing. All I need is an hour and a half there with my team. What they want is they want a second GPR source to come in and confirm what NAPCO has found. And we have a second construction company with their own GPR unit who is coming in at their own expense. Because the thing I've said from this is important. When Geraldo Rivera did his Al Capone thing, where, the vault, the hidden vault and all of that, Geraldo put together a syndicated operation beforehand where there were all these stations that signed up for this because no network wanted to do it. So he syndicated and he made a fortune off this thing. And then what do? Everyone's riveted to the screen for their television for X amount of hours. And they get to the vault, they open up, there's an empty wine bottle in there. With us, we said from the beginning, nobody gets paid. Nobody. We don't make any deals for money. We don't do anything until the body is recovered and positively identified by the FBI. We refused any money. Everyone was doing this. All of us were doing this on our own. This thing has pretty much broken me financially. But I am so sure that I'm right.
Do you anticipate?
I'm sure that Ralph Picardo told the FBI the truth in 1975. I'm sure that Phil Moscato told me the truth in 2007 through 2014. And I'm absolutely sure that Frank Coppola told me the truth in 2019 to 2020 before he died.
And so do you anticipate this construction being done anytime soon? I mean, will there be an excavation in the next?
We're not. There's permits for every step of this thing, and we cannot get a permit to actually dig up a dead body. That would be against the law. So what we have to do is we have to, and what we're more than happy to do, is to get the corroborating evidence, give it to the FBI, and then let them make a decision as to what to do. From what we understand, the decision to get the search warrants came right from the top. And so that would put us right in the Department of Justice. And so, but the FBI is busy these days. You have the former president of the United States tried to overthrow the United States government on January 6, 2021. And the FBI has got a lot of time. They're spending a lot of time doing far more important things in today's terms. But this is a feather in their cap. If this is solved, I mean, my position has been because I'm piggybacking on Picardo's information from 75, even though it was dropped after the FBI failed to find anything at Moscato's son with their earlier search warrant in December 1975. I say that the FBI is responsible for this because it was what I piggybacked on. I knew about that. That's how I knew to ask Moscato about that. And because of Moscato, that's why I got the phone call from the son. The son introduces me to the brother. The brother says, here's what my dad told me as to where he buried. To me, not only that, but there's a reward up here. I think the reward still exists. And as far as I'm concerned, that reward goes to the family, goes to this guy's family. I don't want any part of it. And so, so the point is we've really tried to be honorable on this thing. We have not been pursuing money on this thing or anything. Now, if we find Hoffa, I can assure you we're going to be reaching for the moon and the stars at that point, because we have a lot of people on our team who've done a lot of work. And again, it's all everyone's done it at their own expense.
Sure. Well, no one, Dan, has done more work on this than you. So we really appreciate.
I still own this case. There's another great investigator out of Detroit named Scott Bernstein, who is Scotty is he's probably the world's expert on the Detroit mob, and which they call the Detroit Partnership. Just like the Chicago Mafia is the Chicago outfit, the Detroit Mafia is the Detroit Partnership. I mean, these guys aren't knuckle draggers. These guys are college educated guys who run a very sophisticated operation. Yes, they have the knuckle draggers on staff, but they are people who do business and do business well.
Right. Well, Dan, we've gone over 2 hours here, so I'm sensitive about your time. I could talk about this type of stuff. I could talk about this stuff for hours more, but anyways, it's incredibly fascinating, and it's still an open case, which is so what makes it. I mean, it's been going on for decades.
Well, what's funny about this is that if I'm wrong, the story that's going to hold up in public is going to be the Irishman and Frank Sheeran story. That's going to be the story that's out there, and that will be the as false as it is. That'll be the story that people embrace as to what happened to Jimmy Hoffa. Frankly, I like the movie very much. I had a very nasty conversation with Robert De Niro about this, and I told him he got conned by Frank Sheeran, and he got very defensive about that. It wasn't a pleasant conversation. I mean, this is a guy I really wanted to get along with, but I told him that he got conned by this guy, fall in love with this perpetrator, and was doing a movie that had no basis in fact. And so, I thought the movie was very well done. I really enjoyed the movie. I've seen it a lot. And so, but this is a real feather in the cap for the FBI to solve this thing. And all we want is a very generous acknowledgement once this thing is over. Once again, I'm right. Hoffa is there, or at least he was there. I know all this construction was going on. All the holes are digged. I don't know what's happened since then, but Hoffa was buried at Brother Moscato's stuff.
Right. Well, I'll tell you what, we'll definitely be paying attention, and I'll be following the news to see what happens next. And thank you so much for agreeing to appear. This is my first episode, and it's been incredibly interesting. And I'm going to follow up, and hopefully you and I can have further conversations about Hoffa, but not only that, but about all the other incredibly interesting work that you've done.
You're doing some great work, and I'm a big fan of yours. So you call me anytime you want.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dan. You have a good one.
Thank you. You too.
All right.